today's webinar.
Hi everyone, fitting, and we'll answer your questions at the end of the session. So, brief intro to responsive web design. I'm going to make some assumptions that that you guys probably know a little bit about this subject, but we'll start at the beginning anyway. About 4 years ago, it's actually 4 years next month, Ethan Marcotte wrote an article for List Apart called Responsive Web Design. In that article, Ethan basically took a series of steps towards thinking about how we solve the problem of dealing with the fact that we have all sorts of new devices out here in the world that have all sorts of new requirements around how we display information on our web pages. So basically, prior to about 2007 and the introduction of the iPhone and Android, most of the browsing experiences we had were on desktop browsers, and the capabilities of the desktop kept getting better and better and better, and we kept building sites that basically worked well with that structure. And a lot of the sites that we built were fixed width, they had lots of content on them, they had a certain assumption about the performance of the device that they were running on. And Ethan basically said, you know what, that's great, that's awesome, but it causes us some problems now that we have all these new lovely browsers and devices that will actually let us use the real web in our pocket or on a small screen device. And so he basically sat down and said, there's a couple different techniques that we can deal with to handle this. The idea was that basically said, we're not going to basically say we're going to have a responsive site, or sorry, a desktop-based site and a mobile site, which was sort of the parity that we had before. We're going to sit down, we're going to say we're going to have this responsive material that's going to basically cover a whole bunch of things. We can have an optimal experience for everybody, and we can do it with a standards-based series of ways of handling this. The techniques that he basically came up with were three sort of things that already existed, but he glued them together. One was the notion of fluid grids, where basically we have designs that allow us to change the layout of the page depending upon what's happening. So, think about it this way. This is actually really going back to sort of the default of the way the web works. Before we started to use CSS and even things like tables to sort of lock our designs together, HTML is responsive by nature. Basically, the argument was say, let's take the structures we have around CSS and the structures that we have around JavaScript and not use them to lock the page in place, but actually allow the page to flow as content moves back and forth in different viewport sizes. He also proposed the idea of using flexible images, and really here the idea was that rather than locking images to specific physical sizes, we would allow them to again stretch and flow based on the way that the viewport changed. And the last technology was media queries. And basically this was something relatively new at the time. It was a concept that came up with CSS3, and the idea was that basically by looking at and interrogating certain properties of the browser in CSS, we could basically choose to have different types of CSS loading for different conditions. The most obvious case was around screen width, and that's actually how most of responsive design initially started, was basically saying we're going to have this notion of, well, as the screen is basically of a certain width, we'll have our design change. These three pieces together led to the totality of responsive design as Ethan Marcotte defined it 4 years ago. You can see here an example. This is actually the Cantina website, and you can see that we have a responsive design in place here. If we look at that, in the center, we've got our main website view, or what you might think of as the desktop view. And in that view, we've got an experience that basically covers a lot of imagery. We have more content that's available and visible on the screen. We've got all the sort of trappings you'd expect from a desktop site, including the idea of having sort of navigation across the top. As we start to scale down to the tablet, which is on the left-hand side, you can see that the screen starts to change a little bit. The layout changes a little bit. We were taking the images and compressing them a little bit more. We've changed our navigation, most importantly. We no longer have the banner across the top. We've got the traditional hamburger view. And as we go to the right-hand side and we actually start to get down to the phone aspect ratio, we end up having things like stacking the content in different ways, and we have different layouts and different setups based on the requirements of that screen. So I want to talk just really quickly about the idea that there's a lot of resources out there for responsive design, and it's particularly around the stuff that Ethan was talking about. And one of the best of them is a site by Brad Frost called This Is Responsive. Basically, within the site, Brad captures a bunch of different things, or the patterns of responsive design. A lot of resources, everything from sort of, I want to get started, to case studies, to why is responsive actually worth doing from a financial perspective or from a marketing or SEO lift perspective. He really gives a great overview, and this is a wonderful resource. I think if you want to dive into some of the details on technique for responsive design, this is probably one of the best resources out there. So I mentioned a couple times the idea that we had this article come out 4 years ago. We had these 3 key techniques that we were supposed to be applying, and that was sort of the definition of responsive web design for probably about 2.5 minutes. Not long after people started to use these techniques, they realized that we actually needed a bit more than that. And what's happened is that over the last few years, we've seen the definition of responsive kind of expand and change a little bit, and a lot of things have happened. We've got the idea of responsive plus server-side. This is something that Luke Wroblewski coined a few years ago. And the idea is basically that we do responsive as was originally envisioned, but we also do some server-side pieces there. We also have adaptive delivery, which is a similar concept. And the idea is, again, that we're having the back-end parts of the system basically make determinations about the behavior of the browser and then send, or the properties and capabilities of the browser, and then send material to the browser as needed. We have things like responsive email, right? So responsive design doesn't just pertain anymore to just the web as we think about it in the browser. Now email needs to be responsive because I might be writing HTML email, and I've got to deliver that to any device. So we now have that concept. We have responsive typography. This is actually a really key thing, and it's kind of funny that it was sort of missed in the initial definition of responsive design, was the notion that type design really is a big part of web design as a whole. It's a key part of our way we think about content. Setting content hierarchy and those kind of things is really important. And actually having typography that works well across a series of devices is more than simply just saying I want to scale the type to be readable. So that's become a key element. Responsive and content management systems. This is actually something that's actually become a big deal, because I think what we've realized as we started to try and become more and more responsive was that the content management systems and a lot of the other architecture that we use underlying our websites wasn't really built and designed around actually allowing us to be responsive. So we've had to make some changes in how we think about our content strategy, content modeling, content delivery. There's a lot more changes that are happening, and one of the things that we're seeing is that this definition is changing all the time. Jeffrey Zeldman, who's, if you don't know him, he's basically probably one of the major forces behind standards-based web development. A couple of years ago, he wrote an article basically saying that responsive design really wasn't what people thought it was, and the idea was that if we look at the key core idea that Ethan Marcotte had, that's great. The techniques are awesome. That's wonderful. But there's a deeper concept in there, and that deeper concept is one that basically allows us to actually embrace a much broader and wider range of ways we can think about how we actually build for the web. Mark Bolton, I think, who runs Mark Bolton Design, is now they were just acquired, actually, weren't they?
Yep.
So Mark Bolton basically has a great way to think about this, which is to say that responsive design has grown into a term that represents change above all else. And when you think about what the goal is for responsive, with the idea that we're really trying to say, I have a lot of different platforms I want to deal with today. Tomorrow I want to be future friendly and deal with the fact that those platforms might change. Really, this is about building design systems that allow us to handle that notion of change. So one thing I want to spend just a couple of seconds on is responsive performance. This is actually a bear for a lot of people. Basically, one of the big knocks against responsive design, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about responsive retrofits, one of the big knocks against responsive web design has been around performance and the lack of focus on it. And I think in the last year or so, this has changed a lot. Guy Podnarny wrote a great piece actually on performance implications of responsive, and basically pointed out quite clearly that it's not actually about responsive design as a key concept. Responsive itself isn't slow, but many of the implementations certainly are. And if we don't keep a focus on performance, then we're going to actually run some distinct problems with how we implement responsive overall. So with that, I think we'll talk a little bit about responsive from the ground up. I guess the first question, and I think I'll kick some of this over to Matt too, but the first question would be, why would we do responsive from the ground up? What are the advantages, and why would this be the key driver? I mean, Matt, I think when I think about this, I think that the main one is basically that it basically allows me to really come back to the notion of dealing with the fact that there's a lot I can do under the covers to make my site better overall, not just simply to respond.
Yeah, so I mean, from the responsive design, as you mentioned just a couple seconds ago, you have to think about the performance. And if you're starting from the ground up, it's much easier to make decisions based on things that will be more performant for your users, to have faster experiences, have simpler experiences for your users, And it's a lot easier to make the tough choices
Mm-hmm.
that are required to meet those needs. Whereas the retrofit sort of, you've already made those decisions. You have to then kind of live with them.
Right, right.
We'll cover that a little bit later.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think clarity and consistency is a big part of it, right? I mean, and you kind of said it, being simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually making the simpler choices. It's much harder to do that when you're working from an existing framework, when you can kind of throw everything away, or at least pare back to the basics. It's a great thing. You know, it does definitely also set you up for the idea that you're not just building for today, but building for tomorrow. I mean, if we look at why responsive matters, specifically this moment, it's because the life cycle of a lot of websites is up, right? If we look back at 3, 4, 5 years ago, a lot of companies basically had come to a position where they built a site and then they knew they're going to have to redesign it at some point, and now we're coming back to that. And I think responsive doesn't remove you from the responsibility of having to redesign your site, but it may make future redesigns easier or clearer because it's pulled a lot of things away.
It will definitely make it easier to sort of refresh it, your site as the future moves forward. So
exactly. So I think from our perspective, responsive is a great thing. You should do it. If you can do it ground up, you should. But there's actually some problems for a lot of folks in trying to do this. We've encountered this in our own experience with some of our clients, and we've seen it generally in the industry. A key issue here is that really sometimes it's not possible to do a complete redesign. You may have just done one, right? Sometime in the last 1 or 2 years, maybe you did a redesign, and at that time, mobile didn't factor into it. And there are many reasons why that could be. It could have been a budgetary consideration. It could have been that it was already in process. It could be that your audience at the time wasn't particularly mobile focused, although I suspect for everyone that's changing. Beyond that, there are some big cost and time implications for doing a ground-up responsive redesign. You really are talking about, for anyone who's ever done a redesign of any kind, it's not easy to do. This is not any less complex. I mean, if we look at web development from the very beginning to today, complexity has just increased. So doing a responsive design isn't going to be less complex.
But your first responsive design is always going to be the most expensive.
Exactly, and most painful.
And then the cost of the responsive design sort of kind of blends in with normal cost after that.
Exactly. I think there's actually a long tail effect that, and it's hard to prove this right now because we're still in the early days, but I suspect we're actually going to see responsive, if we do it right up front, we'll actually have a long tail effect of reducing costs overall, not just flattening it.
Yeah, no, responsive design actually should be reducing long-term maintenance costs. Every time there's a new device, your site just works. You don't have to run out and test it and hope that it works. When Apple releases the iPhone 6 and it's a slightly larger screen, your site should just work.
Exactly. So, I think another aspect of this is that doing the mobile-first design is hard. It requires you to think about constraints that you may not have thought about before. If you don't have experience with it, you don't have the right tools. It's really not easy to do. It's funny because when people first started talking about mobile first, a lot of folks said, well, that's great, but how do I even scale that up? It's not easy to do. So with that in mind, you have to think about content strategy. You have to think about the design patterns, and frankly, performance design. We've kind of hit that gong a few times, and the reason is it's really, really important. You have to make sure that you're thinking about it, and not everybody is in a good position to deal with that. It may require changes to the underlying architecture. Not easy to do. And I think the last thing is really around testing. The more you focus on responsive, and this is frankly something that happens regardless of how you implement responsive. How do you test the site? How do you actually make sure that that your design system flexes in the right way? How do you set your breakpoints? How do you do all those things? Maybe not everyone wants to tackle all of those problems at once.
But even user testing is difficult here because, to conduct a usability test on a mobile site, you basically have to get the device into someone's hand. There's not a lot of options for recording how the user interacts with it, so you literally have to stand over their shoulder and that just makes people nervous. And so we actually have experienced this, recently on a couple of our projects on how do we user test responsive sites, and it's still, there's a lot of room for improvement there.
So I think let's just go through some of the basics. I mean, we've talked about the key techniques in the front end of responsive design already a little bit, but definitely the mobile first approach. If you're going to do this, start from your most constrained viewport size, your most constrained capabilities in terms of device. Understanding your content strategy. This is really, really important. One of the side effects of the way that sort of the desktop site has grown up is that we stopped having to make certain types of decisions. And so our content strategy is basically we're sort of, hey, we'll just get all the content into a content management system someplace, and we'll throw them up on the pages, and every page can have as much content as we want. You can see this in home pages all the time. It's not hard to basically find a home page that basically was designed by committee, and where no one made any content decisions because everything's going to go on the home page.
Yeah, and we're actually at a stage of web design where everything is very slick.
Mm-hmm.
As bandwidth has increased, as monitor size has increased, as retina displays have grown, we've actually started to, every site is just this massive image with some text and more massive images throughout the site. And ultimately, that doesn't really work for users, especially on mobile.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pay for the data that you send them.
So you need to keep all that in mind. I think you have to understand the impact on your architecture. It's really important to sit down and look at, what does this mean around the way that you built your site? If you're rebuilding from scratch, hopefully you're adopting, HTML5, CSS3, latest version of whatever JavaScript framework you use, because those things will help you. But if you have to think about the idea that, your developers may not be up to speed with those technologies, you have to look at how your content management system is actually structured. Does it have, for instance, simple things like responsive preview? Does it give your users the ability to separate their content from their markup such that they won't destroy your responsive design when you go to do it? There's a lot going on here. Do you need to implement a responsive images solution or adaptive images solution in the background? What do you need to do around caching? There's a lot of these problems that you have to solve. And being aware of all of them is really important up front. And this is, again, one of the reasons why doing a ground-up responsive design can be difficult because you're required to think about all these things. You need to check your breakpoints, and you need to really consider how you're going to do your backend. So, we talked about mobile first a couple of times, and I guess there probably is a key question on why do we keep harping on that? Why is that so important? And it really comes down to the fact that you want to start from your least capable experience in some ways, or maybe the one that, put differently, the one that has the most constraints on your design. Part of the reason we got into this problem in the first place is because we got to a place where the technologies we were using were no longer constrained by their devices. And that, again, forced us to not make certain choices. By starting with mobile screen, we can ask ourselves really, some interesting questions, like content priority. What really matters on the page? How do we order it? How do we reorder it as we start to grow outside of that view? What do we do when we don't have a fast processor? So, Matt was just talking about that we need to think about, the performance over the wire. Let's say I'm delivering a very fancy, or I want to deliver a very fancy JavaScript intensive visualization. Is my phone even going to be able to handle that? Is my browser going to be able to deal with that? And then variable connection speeds, and also frankly the cost of connections. You don't really know, even though these devices are connected all the time. You don't know really how they're connected, where they're connected, with the users dropping in and out. So take all those constraints, make those your key assumptions, and start from that. Once you've done that, that really gives you really a great foundation for building upwards. So if we think about the notion of progressive enhancement, starting from your basic core, and then as capabilities get better, adding more onto it up to a point, right? There's a point where you say, I'm done, I don't want to add any more. I don't need to add any more. But adding capability, that's great. So progressive enhancement and mobile first work hand in glove, and taking those two approaches together will just lead to better results overall. Content strategy. We've talked about this a couple of times. I think this is a key thing. We found that when we first started doing responsive sites, our approach was pretty much a design perspective first. If you go back 3-4 years, we were like, hey, this should be pretty straightforward. We can understand these techniques, we can put them in place. But as we've gone through this for the last few years, we found that really diving into how the content structure, diving into how the site actually works is key. And if you don't do that, it'll just fail. You have to ask yourself some questions around, the types of content you have. Do you need all that content anymore? Is anyone using it? You need to look at your analytics and understand where the dark corners of your site are. You have to ask yourself the question, what matters the most? And how do you actually reconfigure things on the page so that when the viewport changes or the device capabilities change, that you're still keeping those things that matter in view of the user, or at least not too far away, just off the edge of the screen or just one swipe away. This is a real key question. How do you handle non-text content? I mean, this is something that I think, Matt and I had an engagement a few years ago where we were dealing with the notion of responsive ads. And this was a key problem back then. This was, how do I get ads, which are typically not responsive in their nature, to work across all these sites? But even things like visualizations or other types of media.
Yeah, responsive ads is still an area that there's not a lot of work has been done. If you look at a lot of ads on mobile devices, they're really just banner ads that have been shrunk down. So there's still a lot of room for improvement in that area.
Mm-hmm. And I think also in terms of things like managing, I mentioned the case about visualizations the other day, a couple minutes ago, but that idea that how do you manage sort of a polymorphic nature for those sort of non-text content pieces? Like everyone knows about the sort of the art direction use case in images, right? Where basically it's not appropriate simply to shrink an image down, right? The flexible images idea is good up to a point, but there's a point where you don't want to just be shrinking things. You want to actually be saying, I need to put a new image in place here. Yep. So you have to think about those ideas. And then, I've already said this a couple of times, but I'll say it one more time just to drive it home. Your content management system itself may need to change. Either how you use your current system, or you may need to find a new one. So responsive and adaptive. As I mentioned earlier, Luke Wroblewski calls this res. The idea here is basically that responsive design, as it was first envisioned, really was around the front end. The techniques were all in the layer of JavaScript and CSS and HTML. They really didn't go any further than that. But we started to realize pretty early on that wasn't sufficient, especially since we didn't have solutions like the soon-to-be a standard picture element, and we had to find ways to sort of work around some of those problems. And things like having to deal with the non-textual content elements was definitely something we had to deal with. So we came up with this idea of, originally, adaptive really kind of meant the idea of building device-specific experiences. And while we kind of came to an agreement, and I think this is universally true, some people may disagree with me, but we came to an agreement that's probably not the best approach in the long run. We did kind of start to understand that specifically in certain cases, we'd have to still adopt those techniques. And so the idea was basically to say, well, let's put that stuff on the server side as much as we can. Let's put that in the back end and allow the server to make certain decisions based on the capabilities we understand from the device. There's been an interesting sort of interplay between these two, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done here. There's some solutions that are coming out now that are really trying to focus on this. There's a lot of SaaS solutions that are trying to solve this problem. But I think the main thing is just sort of understanding how you segment your overall responsive design. And then also keep in mind, this makes this stuff more complex. So if you can avoid doing something like this, if you can keep it entirely to front-end techniques, do so. That'll make your site more flexible. Frankly, it'll make it more future-friendly, and it will make your content editors happier. So responsive retrofitting. All right, mobile later. If you're not going to do mobile first, and sometimes you can't, you should definitely consider doing mobile at some point. And maybe that's simply deferring and doing your full responsive design later down the line. Maybe it's putting a mobile specific site in place for a while. There are definitely ways you can handle it, but one of the ways that we think that is an interesting way to handle this is really to do retrofitting of your existing site. Basically there's some advantages to this. One of which is that basically you're using your existing code in your existing site. There are some caveats to that though. It had better be standards-based before you start trying to do this. If you're not using HTML5 already, or at least clean HTML4, you're probably going to have a hard time doing this. If you're not using CSS that's standards-based, or if you have a pretty kind of funky setup, it's not going to work well for you. So make sure that your site is kind of already groomed before you try going down this route. It does give a really good pathway to dealing with the screen-focused responsiveness, dealing with those issues of I need to present to someone on a smaller screen. It's not a great approach, frankly, for handling some of the problems of dealing with performance, because it tends to be additive and adds complexity on top of an existing design. And it doesn't necessarily give you all the device capability stuff that you might get if you're taking a more pure responsive approach. So, kind of keeping with the key concerns, reworking an existing design can be challenging. You're talking about basically ripping pieces of your design out. One of the biggest problems is basically retrofitting the layouts. How do you actually get a design that wasn't really ever intended to be responsive to actually fit? So it's not enough to simply say I want to insert the meta tag that's going to allow me to do responsive and then change up my CSS. Your content source order and things like that may need to change. Non-text content is still a challenge. Right, that doesn't change. That's something you'll always have to deal with. Performance really can be difficult. This is actually when people talk about responsive being slow, a lot of it is due to responsive retrofit of one type or another, where someone's basically said, hey, I'm just going to add CSS and JavaScript. My site's responsive. But they forgot that they're still shoving those 10 megabyte images down onto a phone. It doesn't really take care of some of the content and focus issues. Typically, if you're taking this approach, you're not reworking all your content. You're not reworking your content strategy. And frankly, it can still be expensive. It's still responsive design, it still adds complexity, but it's probably less expensive overall than doing a full redesign. So just as a sort of a larger picture thing, there's a question about how you might approach it. You can do sort of what we think of as an incremental retrofit, or you can do a site-wide retrofit. An incremental retrofit would basically be choosing parts of your site, say your home page and a couple of key sections, and making those responsive first. And then choosing to basically see how that works, kind of working through that, and then basically having the responsiveness of your site sort of grow over time and spread across the whole site. This works well for sites that have deep segmentation, where they may have something like a particular set of content that's around products, or a particular set of articles and things like that, where you can basically bite off subsections of your site, or maybe even if you have something like a microsite, and you can handle that first. It really does give you the ability to sort of take a linear approach to this and say, I want to do several different pieces. But, the downside is you end up feeling a little bit clunky. So the New York Times actually has this approach right now on their site. Their homepage isn't responsive, but the individual article pages are. So when if you go to the New York Times homepage on your iPhone or your Android device, you get this basically the pinch and zoom approach. But as soon as you click through an article, everything scales nicely. Now, there's certain reasons why they've chosen to do that, but at the end of the day, it does feel a little bit awkward.
It's definitely jarring for users to go to a mobile-friendly page and then click off to another site or another page within your site that's then non-mobile friendly. Mm-hmm. It's almost like getting a nice email on your phone, clicking through to find out that you're basically at a non-mobile site.
Exactly.
So it's always something you want to try and avoid.
Yep.
If possible.
So then you have the site-wide, right? And this is something where basically your goal is going to be, I'm going to take everything. I'm going to deal with everything at once. I'm going to make all my pages, all my content with my site responsive right from the get-go. Now, the trouble with this is, frankly, if you have a lot of segmentation, again, you have to touch a lot of things. You got to look at a lot of different layouts. You got to do a lot of different work. If your site is fairly similar page to page, this approach probably will work for you. It's also still not really easy to do if your HTML is not clean. If your pages are built in a way that's just hard to deal with, if you're trying to touch all those pages and you have a lot of different templates, it's going to suck.
A lot of times on the site-wide retrofits, I actually see people basically just throw out the HTML and CSS, rewrite it based on the existing site structure and site design, mm-hmm. and that actually might be a little bit faster and cost less than trying to fix everything.
Right, exactly. Rather than trying to pull everything apart.
Right.
So basics. This time we're going to dive a little bit lower into this, not to the code level, but big things are you got to add the viewport meta tag. That's like the first and primary requirement. If you don't do that, and the good thing is that's actually trivial to do. And in fact, actually, there's some arguments that have been made that you should do that even on a non-responsive page because it allows you to specify distinctly the size of the page. I've never bothered to do it that way. I don't know if you ever have, but some people say you should do it. You really need to disassemble your fixed width layout. And again, I'm making an assumption you have one, but if you're doing a retrofit, you probably do. This usually means going into your CSS and ripping out whatever you've got that's setting max widths or widths of defined sizes on all your elements. It might be simple enough. You may have to get rid of them entirely. You may also have to do something where you simply just change the actual style from a fixed defined width to something more flexible. This is also the place where, frankly, if you're not doing it, you're going to stop using pixels and move to a relative unit of some type. You need to determine your new breakpoints, and we'll talk about that more in a second. You've really got to figure out how to handle the layout of elements on the page, and we'll come back to that too. That's kind of a tricky one. You've got to re-implement or hide elements that don't work for different breakpoints. So now this is kind of controversial, right? Because one of the things that people said originally was, oh, I can use display none when I get to a point where something doesn't work. That's probably one of the worst things you can actually do for a couple of reasons. One, you're probably making a decision for the user that they didn't really intend for you to make. And two, that's weight you're still sending down. So you probably don't really want to hide things, but this is the time when you want to think about specific elements and if you need to change them for specific devices or breakpoints. You got to test a lot. whether you're doing your rewrite, partial rewrite as Hondo mentioned, or if you're simply tearing things apart, this is really, you got to make sure stuff works. And frankly, it's going to be tricky because you're not going to be sure where things are breaking because of the changes you made versus things that just simply never worked. And you got to monitor performance, because the biggest knock against these redesigns in this way is that at the end of the day, you ended up adding a lot of complexity. Pages are going to be heavy, heavy, heavy. So selecting breakpoints. Your key thing here is to re-implement for flexibility. Your first breakpoint is going to be your desktop design, and that's kind of a no-brainer. But if you're looking for someplace to start, you're going to work down. And notice this is sort of the exact opposite of what I was talking about with mobile first, right? We're starting from the most constrained environment and kind of working our way up to the big screen. Here, we're going to start and work down. We're going to basically take that page, we're going to put it in our browser, and do what every designer does, but no user ever does. We're just going to start basically flexing the window. See how it breaks. I mean, that's the key thing here. You're really looking to see, where does something fall apart? You're not making any assumptions about the size of the device. You're not making assumptions about the size of the screen. You're simply saying, something's not working anymore. And when you find that thing not working, it's time for a new breakpoint, and it's time to write a little CSS. It may also be time to write some new HTML, frankly, or build a new element. And you keep doing that until you get down to however far you want to go. Typically that'll be whatever you want to say, maybe the aspect ratio of the old iPhone, but you're looking for your bare minimum, and you just keep working until you get there. Any other things on?
The only thing is, the one thing about retrofits is that it sort of leaves out, when you start from a mobile first perspective, you get, you support browsers that don't support CSS, you support browsers that don't support JavaScript, and you're building up via progressive enhancement. When you're going from the retrofit and you're going from the top down, you tend to, you sort of miss out on that component. And that is, feature phones still make up the largest portion of internet users in the world. So, it's kind of, that's one of a pretty big trade-off there.
Mm-hmm. So handling layout issues. So by default, you're going to have everything basically flex based on source order. This basically means when you look at the HTML, literally what elements are coming before other elements. So if you had a div that's got some position in the page, it's just going to go ahead and let it move. And the same thing is going to be true for all the other elements that kind of follow out of that. Now, let's jump to the next slide, I think, because the problem with that is that sometimes things flex, and they flex in ways you don't want. So like in this case, say you have an article, and the content is sitting below your banner, and your sidebar is doing a nice job of doing what sidebars do, which is literally sitting next to your content. But if you let it flex in source order, that sidebar, whoops, it's appearing below the content. Now it's out of context. It no longer makes any sense. Your content sort of falls apart. Other cases would be things that just get pushed down the page. Elements that you never really expected them to kind of be where they are. So you really want to try to avoid that if possible, and that's actually a key thing. So as you proceed, you really want to make sure that you're considering things like off-page layout. So looking at elements like the sidebar and adding an affordance to the page when you get below a certain size that allows you to say the element's off to the side still, it's off screen, but here's a way you can bring it back into view. Alternatively, you can consider collapsing content. So if you have things where content's coming in source order but stacking up in ways that aren't appropriate, you can actually go ahead and have them basically reduce themselves in size. And notice I'm saying collapsing, not removing. So rather than having simply a display none, you change the visual representation of things so that it has some affordance for allowing to expand so we can dive back into it. Lastly, I kind of want to mention a couple of resources. Christopher Lyon wrote this book, Mobilizing Websites, a couple of years ago, and basically he lays out sort of a step-by-step on here's the things you need to think about. He kind of goes into more detail about some of the elements that we just talked about, and he really gives you an idea of some of the difficulties you're going to run into and some of the problems that are going to occur. I highly recommend this book. It's really it's a short, fast read, but well worth having. And then lastly, I want to mention sort of an alternative to some of the stuff we've talked about responsive retrofits, and that's this RWD retrofit library. The idea here is, remember we talked about the idea of sort of doing adaptive delivery back when we talked about pure responsive design and starting from scratch. RWD retrofit basically is a client-side system that essentially attempts to handle this notion of dealing with needing to add responsiveness onto an existing website via JavaScript, essentially. This isn't an ideal approach for some sites. Frankly, there are times when it starts to fall down, but it's pretty good if you're looking for something where you need a quick hit on things. I will say that this works best again when your site is already kind of clean and ready to go. So with that, I think we'll jump into Q&A.
So excuse me, we have a couple of questions. Talking about content management systems, are there any systems that you recommend? I mean, or what should you be looking for in a responsive content management system? And also, I just want to point out that if anyone has any other questions, please use the question interface in the GoToMeeting panel.
So, yeah, it's a good question. I think first off, the things you should be looking for in a content management system are one, that the content management platform itself has some awareness of responsive design, that it's starting from the notion of they're keeping separation between your content and the markup, that it has the notion of responsive previews, that it attempts to avoid things like WYSIWYG editing, frankly, that if it has templates already built into it, those templates already provide some of the structure and framework that you need. So, WordPress would be an example of a sort of bare bones CMS that a lot of people use. Some WordPress templates aren't responsive, some are, and you want to pick those first.
And you can definitely customize something like a WordPress or a Drupal to be more responsive friendly using sort of the off-the-shelf plugins.
Exactly. I think along the other lines, I think a lot of content management systems are looking now to move closer to understanding adaptive and responsive. They're really starting to implement features specifically geared towards the new sort of way we're dealing with this. So one of the things that's happening is content management systems. When we say content management system in this context, we usually mean web content management system, which is really, in a lot of cases, ends up being a system where we're managing our content and we're tying it to the display and delivery layer of things. And we're starting to realize that we need to break that out. We need to basically say content management is a separable problem from web delivery. And I think a lot of CMSs, and we've had disconnected CMSs for a long time, content systems like TeamSite, Percussion, Rhythmics, there have been several of them around, and I think we're starting to see other content management systems realize that they need to actually deal with that separation better, and they're giving us better tools for concentrating on authoring and creating content versus styling and delivering that content, and that separation is a key. There's a platform, there's actually a company that we partner with called Blue Train Mobile, or actually it's now Blue Train IO, I believe, that's actually trying to build a responsive CMS, and they're doing some interesting things there. I definitely think it's worth taking a look at.
And one more question, unless something else comes in. Can you talk a little bit more about adaptive design and why that adds complexity?
Yeah, so there are a few reasons why that adds complexity. One of which is that, frankly, you have to understand more layers of the site. So if we're talking about a pure responsive design from the front end perspective, all your implementations in HTML, CSS, some JavaScript, it's all in the front end. As soon as you start adding an adaptive design, as soon as you're starting that res material back in the back end, you now have multiple layers that have to coordinate between each other to actually produce your design. A simple example might be if you have a particular video and you want to send a different video down, you now have to basically have some mechanism for understanding how to discover which video you should send, whether that's a client-side lookup with JavaScript or it's a server-side thing like browser sniffing, which if you can ideally not do that, don't do it. But basically, how do you actually determine what's going to happen there? So you've added complexity between the client and the server. They have to have a conversation. You basically add state, and state always adds complexity. And then there's the delivery mechanism itself. Essentially, how do you actually sit down and say, I'm going to actually determine how to produce this stuff, or deliver the right mechanism at the right time. And then the last part of it, and this is maybe more germane in the long term, is how do you actually build that content, right? So it's easy to say, I want to have an art direction use case, and I want to have 3 different versions of the image, or I want to have 3 different versions of my headline, all of which will be appropriate to the user's context. That sounds great, but somebody's got to write that content. Someone's got to produce those images. Someone has to design those multiple versions of that visualization or that tool or whatever it is you're presenting. So as you start to bring adaptive in play, and you start to look at essentially trying to deal with all the different ways you're going to present that content, it's just naturally going to basically add some additional work to you. Now, there are tools that are coming about that are attempting to solve some of these problems, certainly in terms of things like automatic management of images. Responsive IO is a good example of a platform that's adding some tools there to make that easier. There's tools like Trilbus Snow, Yotta is another tool. It's YOTTAA, I think. Is another tool that's attempting to basically deal with some of these delivery issues. They're also attempting to deal with some of the performance issues, doing things like concatenation of your scripts for you automatically and that kind of thing. So, any other questions?
I think that's it for today. So thank you guys for presenting.